And you're live.
All right. Hi, my name is Al Brand. I am from Bell Textron. I'm a senior technical fellow for flight technology. I have my colleagues here. Bob Milliken, he was a co-author of the student design competition RFP. And Jeff is from our tech fellow group as well. And I don't know if you want to introduce yourselves.
You want to go first?
Yeah, I'm Bob Milliken, tech fellow for loads development and competency lead for aerodynamics, loads and acoustics and ice protection.
And then Jeff Cloud, so technical competency leader for structural design or airframe design and systems engineering.
So I don't want to take a lot of time, but I'd like to say this is a chance for students to ask questions about this RFP, and feel free to go ahead and start asking your questions, and we'll try to do the best we can to answer them.
Thanks, Bob. Shall we start the Aerobility section now? Okay, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are around the world. This is a great opportunity for us at Aerobility to share a little bit what it's like to have a disability. We're very excited to be part of this competition, which is helping you to understand how the future of flight can incorporate access to make sure that the real future of transportation and to change society to make sure that disabled people, whatever challenges they face, can participate in future flight, which is such an exciting part of aviation moving forwards. What I'd like to do first is introduce my two colleagues, Marcus and Harvey. Marcus is a team member here that helps us to look after our outreach projects and our marketing, communications and fundraising. I'll let him say a couple of words in a second. And Harvey is, like me, has a disability and looks after our programs for young people. Guys, do you want to say hi?
Hi, nice to see everybody. Thanks for taking the time to come and hear what we have to say about accessibility in future flight. We hope it proves useful, and fire any questions you can.
Hi, it's really good to be here, and as Marcus said, any questions that can help us to further the future of aviation are accepted, and we'll do the best we can to answer them fully.
So let's do this together. We've never done this before, and I guess you've never attended a webinar to talk about disability. So let's try and move this forward together. And as I say, let's keep it open-ended and let's answer and work forwards, answering your questions as best we can. And we're really looking forward to hearing what you'd like to know. So we thought we'd start by telling you a bit about what Aerobility does and how we support people with disabilities. So we've got a few PowerPoint slides to start with. So Jim, let's go to the first slide, please. And what I'll also say, Marcus and Harvey, please do jump in at any point so we can really enrich what we're saying. So who are we? So Aerobility is a charity which aims to make aviation accessible to people with disabilities. So whatever the age, whatever the disability type, we will make sure that we will try and support that individual to participate. Primarily to fly. So we have a number of adapted light aircraft which work with many disabilities, and we have equipment like the hoist, which can lift somebody safely into the airplane if they need that help. But the third component we use to make aviation accessibility is state of mind and knowledge, and saying, yes, this is possible. So we try and work with everybody to find out what challenges they face and work out ways to remove those barriers. So clearly one of those barriers is physical, so making the environment physically accessible, but also making it financially accessible to actually fundraise with the aviation community to make it possible for anybody to fly, whatever their financial background as well. And we support nearly 1,000 individuals a year. Well, we did before COVID and hopefully getting back to it this year. And about 1/3 of the people we support are former military personnel that have been wounded, injured or sick in service. But really, we encourage the question, if I can fly, what else can I do? Next slide, please, Jim. So we talked about flying. So we provide experienced flights where a disabled person can come to the airfield, have some ground school, and then go get into the airplane and go flying. Not as a passenger, but actually at the controls of that airplane, in charge of their own destiny, with the instructor, experiencing the magic of flight. And the sky is a magical place, as I'm sure many of you know. There's a little bit of magic to the sky, and it's a privilege for us to introduce people to that environment where genuinely we can change lives. But also people are learning to fly. So getting a pilot's license or maybe even moving forwards to get a career in aviation. Harvey, do you want to talk about the education side?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Mike. So a really big part of what we do is with youth engagement. I know firsthand that the younger we can get disabled people captured by aviation, we can have a massive improvement on their lives, especially growing up. That can be particularly tough for a disabled person. So with our education programs, we use aviation as a tool to instill traits such as confidence, communication skills, into these young people, which they can transfer over to their everyday lives and hopefully future careers. We have 2 youth programs here. One is a short course which introduces young people to the magic that is flight. The other is a longer course where we take a group of disabled youngsters who maybe won't ever be a pilot, but introducing them to all the other things that they can do within the sector and still have that fulfilling career. And what it does is we constantly see people doing better in their day-to-day lives in school and college and perhaps going on to get their first job. So it is a valuable part of what we do here.
Thanks, Harvey. And the final, or the third biggest feather in our cap really is the advocacy piece. Part of the reason we are here today is to make sure that the aviation community and the future of aviation considers the needs of disability, and we will advocate for everybody that we can to make sure that they can participate, whatever that aspiration is. We'll come back to that with a bit more detail shortly. Marcus, you can talk us through that. So let's have the next slide, please. So I'll whisk through this real quick, but the background, we started the charity in 1993, and we operate from 2 airfields here in the UK. But also the great thing about airplanes is that you can take them to other airfields. So we do have portable equipment that we can take to other locations. And we have access to 6 adapted aircraft. Simulated flight, synthetic flight simulators are a key part of what we do. It's a great way for disabled people to learn how to move their bodies around the cockpit environment, learn that muscle memory. It's a much cheaper way for people to learn that skill than the real airplane. But also it's a great way, a great low cost way, particularly to introduce people to flight. So that's a real key tool that we use. And we work with the industry to make sure that everybody, whatever their background, be it somebody with a learning disability or perhaps wounded in service, gets a chance to participate. And the age range right now of our participants is 7 through to 99, so a real broad age range too. Next slide, please, Jim. So I mentioned this earlier, I whizzed through this. So we provide experience flights, ongoing respite, so really just a break from your disability. We find that in the sky, people's disabilities melt away. The brain is a funny thing. When you've got a high workload, when you're concentrating on something you love, then you forget about the pain, you forget about the problems you have on the ground. It really is a pain relief for many people. It's a way to forget that they have a disability. Actually, it levels the playing field. Many people say when they're flying, they love it because they're just another voice on the radio. Their disability becomes invisible. Right, next slide, please. Harvey, do you want to just mention this again?
Yeah, so education programs again, as I was saying, the three pillars of that are improving outcomes for disabled youngsters. So just going into a bit more detail about what the actual impact of this is. We hear people doing better at school, making more friends, and just generally finding their day-to-day lives a bit easier. And this is encapsulated in a story we tell of our aviation education program, which is our 9-month-long course. We generally take a group of youngsters who are really socially awkward, they don't like interacting with others, and we take a picture of them lined up against the Aerobility sign on the first day, and they're a metre or two apart and they're looking at the ground, and it's not a very social picture. But we repeat this process on the last day of the course 9 months later, and they're all stood on top of each other with their arms around each other, having a laugh about usually an in-joke for the group. So these programs, although they seem pretty isolated, they really do have an impact which stretches far beyond the confines of the airfield.
Thanks, Harvey. Next slide, please, Jim. Advocacy, Marcus.
Right, yeah. So advocacy is one part of our work that not many people know about, but it's increasingly important and probably has one of the greatest potentials to influence change for the benefit of people living with disability. And what I mean by this is we work with members of the industry, members of government, and members of society to demonstrate what aviation can do for people living with disability. And this competition is one of the examples of the pieces of work we are doing toward that, and one of the most impactful potentially. If you consider that we're talking to 54 students right now who are potentially the future of aviation design, and we are asking you to think about accessibility now before eVTOL has become mainstream technology and transport. If we imagine what was done 70 years ago at the start of commercial aviation, if accessibility had been built in then, baked into the DNA of that transport mode, the experience of 1 in 5 people in the world traveling would be hugely better than it is today. So this is what we are trying to do now to make sure in 20, 30, 40 years time, accessibility is not an issue in eVTOL. This is one great big piece of work for Aerobility, and hopefully you've been picking up on the signals that have been buried in the presentation so far, particularly in the imagery and the words about accessibility in aviation and some of the challenges you need to think about and can pick up on when addressing this issue.
Thanks, Marcus. Yeah, moving on from that, well done to you, you guys showing an interest in this topic and wanting to be part of the future of being on the journey with us. Right, next slide, please, Jim. So I do love a flow chart. This is a bit of an example of how somebody journeys from left to right, the different disability groups in the green boxes, the arrows with the different age groups, the three main methods we use to improve lives: the flying, the ground-based activities, and the knowledge, then the advocacy. And on the right, you can see the 6 grey boxes, which are typical outcomes that we see every day for people with disabilities that participate in aviation, that participate in transport in the sky. So this really does show the value of what being able to engage rather than not engage can make a difference to somebody's life. Next slide, please, Jim. So we wanted to keep that relatively brief. I hope that wasn't too long, but I think that shows you our motivations to wanting to be a part of this competition and to help you to understand disability better. We live and breathe disability every day. We like to think along these last 27 years, we've picked up good experience both personally and every day we're meeting somebody with a different disability and we're enabling them to fly. So I guess in terms of basic principles, it'd be good to hear now what your questions are about interfacing disabled people with your transport solution, with your ideas, and to find out what you would like to know more of. But ultimately, it's not just about the nuts and bolts. It's not just about your design. This needs to sit alongside human attitudes and training and approaches that are taken. You can have the most accessible solution in the world, but if the individual operating that solution has no knowledge of disability, it will ultimately fail. So my first point would be to make you think not just about your design, but how that design is supported by the human aspects. Harvey, have you got anything else to add?
No, as usual, you put it brilliantly, Mike. That is vital that that accessibility in a way becomes a worry of the past, and I think to bake this into the future of aviation today will just improve so many lives going forward. And just thank you for turning up and expressing your interest in being part of the future.
Marcus.
Yeah, 2 things I would say as pieces of advice, certainly things I've picked up along the way. People are disabled by environment quite often. And if an environment is designed with disability in mind, they're not disabled anymore. So that's a thought to take with you. The other thing I would like to make sure everybody thinks about is reduced mobility is not just about wheelchairs. I can imagine most people are thinking about how do I get a wheelchair safely into an eVTOL. That isn't necessarily the question to answer or the only question to answer. Reduced mobility could be a function of sensory impairment, cognitive impairment. So think about user interface with the eVTOL. How does somebody who is blind or deaf understand they are safely in the vehicle? How do they make it go where they want it to? It is much more than just wheelchairs, if I can leave that thought with you as well.
Thanks, Marcus. Right, well, let's get some interaction going. So would anybody like to start the ball rolling with one of your questions?
Oh.
So far, it looks like we're a little shy on questions, but there is a comment that on the contact sheet that your phone number should have a country code in front of it.
That is a good point. We can amend that.
Yep, and I think is the UK plus 44. Is that right?
Yeah, so
it's +44 drop 0.
+44 and drop the 0. That's very true.
All right, let me see if I can fix that on the fly here.
I can do it. I'll put it into the message group as well.
Okay, so while we're waiting for some questions, let me talk to you a little bit about my personal situation. I have a disability called muscular dystrophy, and I use a power chair, an electric wheelchair. I'm a big guy. I'm 6'4". I'm heavier than I should be, shall we say? And my electric wheelchair probably weighs, I think, about 100 kilos. So already you can understand a design challenge for transporting me in an eVTOL. Quite often when I travel in a commercial aeroplane, when I roll up on my wheelchair to the check-in desk, you can see the look of panic in the check-in desk operator's face, thinking, oh, okay, we've got to get this guy through the airport and we've got to get him onto a commercial airplane. So over the years, it has been really hard. And I often think to myself, as Marcus said earlier, if Mr. Boeing in the 1940s and 1950s had thought about wheelchair access, then surely my journey now would be much simpler. But the reality is, getting through the airport is now much easier than it used to be. And clearly, eVTOL and vertiports will be able to solve those challenges relatively easily. That's about parking, that's about access to a disabled toilet, about having support through that environment. But accessing the aircraft or the eVTOL, that's about effectively taking me out of the wheelchair and putting me into a special seat or even a normal seat. But how do you get me as an individual from my wheelchair to the aircraft seat? So think about that. Also, does the wheelchair travel independently from me? Does it travel in a storage space in the vehicle, or do I continue to maybe sit in the wheelchair? So these are all some of the things that I like to think about, thinking about the future of flight. Harvey, what challenges have you had going through the airport and traveling?
So, cheers, Mike. So I have a brain injury called cerebral palsy, which I sustained through an accident when I was being born, actually. So the way it affects me is I have a funny voice, as you can probably hear, and I'm a bit wobbly and unsteady on my feet. So I think for me, aircraft today can be quite cramped as you walk down that aisle, and you have a huge amount of people trying to effectively board at the same time. Obviously, I take a bit longer to do most things. Some of that is through disability, some is incompetence, but we won't go into that. So I think finding a process for boarding, which is less intense, would be really important for me. But also having a bigger space to throw myself around in, and if there are any buttons that need operation or switches, making them just that bit bigger and having to think about where they can go, which is easily accessible without obstructions, would be really handy for someone like me.
Thanks, Harvey. Another key point in general to make about disability is to think about it in two ways. There is something called the medical model of disability, and there is something called the social model of disability. So the medical model of disability really talks about tackling somebody's disability through changing them. So, for example, for somebody that's an amputee that has lost a limb, that's about giving them a prosthetic. That's about effectively curing their disability at the source. The other type of model is the social model. So the social model considers we will leave the individual physically as they are, but we will adapt to the environment around them. So that's about adding a wheelchair ramp, that's about adding a hoist, that's about parking for a disabled vehicle. So as thinking about disability has progressed, clearly the social model is preferable for many environments because you can support more disabilities. So, for example, in your designs, you might think about obvious things like level access, reducing steps into the vehicle, making the doorway as large as possible, making the luggage area big enough to take as big a mobility equipment as possible, be it a walker or a walking stick, crutches, a wheelchair, or maybe it's a bag of equipment needed to support somebody that has a kidney disease and it's their dialysis equipment. So think about every as broad a needs as possible. It also might be about making the environment as tactile as possible, so somebody with a sight impairment can feel their way towards the seat. Make it as bright as possible, so somebody with a sight impairment can see where they need to go. And also consider that there is a spectrum of sort of need around a disability. We did a little bit of work with Heathrow Airport here in London a few years ago, where they were trying to work out what's the best way we can support somebody with a disability through the security channel as they access the secure area of the airport. And they had a real problem because actually some disabled people loved the fact that they were being supported, being asked whether they would like some help to get through security. On the other end, there was fiercely independent disabled people that were almost offended to be asked whether they wanted some help. So it's a real challenge meeting that cross section of awareness about your disability. So that's something to consider as well. You know, some people feel patronised. Some people feel that they're being supported by kind human nature. So that's something to consider as well. So, we got any questions? Everybody is shy.
Yeah, there is quite a number of questions in there, yes.
Good.
If you'd like, I can read them off for you.
Yeah, please do. They're not showing my end.
All right. So the first one comes from Matt. What are the disabilities that you most encounter? For example, mobility, sensory, cognitive. Is it pretty evenly spread? And for each, how do you accommodate them today?
Yeah, so in terms of the numbers, about 2/3 of the people that we work with have what we classify as a physical impairment. So that's somebody with a reduced mobility. About 1/3 of the people that we support have a learning disability. So that's somebody with a brain injury or somebody that's perhaps got a developmental disorder, somebody on the autistic spectrum perhaps. One thing that we're seeing more of is people with a mental health condition. I think part of that is just the sort of the loss of stigma about mental health over the last few years. More people are prepared to admit that they have a mental health condition. So somebody with depression or another, or PTSD, we are understanding that more and more, that is more and more common and more prevalent throughout society. And sometimes people have a mixture of disabilities, of course. So, for example, one lady that we fly, she's a wheelchair user, but she's completely blind as well. So you do have that mixed disability as well.
All right, very good. Our next question comes from Anuj. Is it preferable to integrate mechanisms directly into the design that will be used in the boarding process for disabled passengers?
Harvey, why don't you have a go?
Yeah, I think if I've understood the question correctly, forgive me if I haven't, is that really important that those mechanisms are incorporated from the design phase? but also across the fleet. I do believe that these adaptions shouldn't be on board a specialist craft. It should be across the fleet to make them all accessible as possible, but also to break that stigma. I think if an adaptation is as standard, it's no longer an adaptation. So I think that would be of benefit too. Hopefully that answers the question.
I think that's a good point, Harvey. I think, again, personal experience, if I call a cab in a city, wherever that is in the world, most of the cabs are not accessible for my type of disability. And there'll be 1 or 2 cabs in that city which are accessible with a hydraulic lift to lift somebody in their wheelchair and travel in the wheelchair. But you can bet your bottom dollar that that cab is off the road that day, or that cab is in use with another disabled person. So the more vehicles that you can provide, which are as accessible as possible, you are normalizing the playing field. You're leveling the playing field and effectively, hopefully, making somebody feel less different and more integrated.
So the students are going to have the challenge of looking at the mission that an air taxi has. And if you look at the RFP, you should look closely at that and also realize the challenge you're going to have to have an aircraft that is maybe flexible. But on the other hand, the hardest thing for a vertical lift aircraft to do is to take off, and weight is an absolute killer. And you have to keep in mind that you're going to have airport, it takes off from an airport, it lands at an airport, and you have to answer the question, is it better to duplicate your ramps at each airport, or are you going to carry that with you? That's your challenge.
And of course, the best solution is to have your aircraft designed to integrate with the support equipment that you have at your origin and destination sites. You want to have as much flexibility as possible, but you want not to have to carry the weight.
Yeah, and you'll find that with electric VTOL, you don't have the power that a turbine engine has, and you need to be weight conscious, or you won't get off the ground, and then you can't do the mission. So those are the 2 things that students should be aware of.
Bob, they're great points, but also there's a knowledge limitation as well. So the more complex the solution, then actually you've got a bigger training requirement for each operator in that environment as well. So that's something to consider as well.
That's fantastic. Thank you. It was a great discussion. Our next question also comes from Matt. Are there certain individuals with sensory impairments? Are they more sensitive to the nuisances and nuances of flying?
A very good question, and yes, our experience is that people with perhaps on the autistic spectrum are get very worried about new environments they've never been to before. And I think this is where we find synthetic flight is a great solution. So somebody that's nervous, we can bring them to the airfield to be around aircraft, the noises, the sights, the sounds, but also to look at the flight simulator. We can fire up the flight simulator. They can just sit on the ground and get used to that environment and then fly the sim. So it takes time, but it's a great low-cost way of removing that concern, removing that worry about that new environment. So again, that's a big challenge, and how you move that into a commercial environment such as eVTOL will be is something to think about. I'm not sure what that solution is. Harvey, you've got experience of that yourself, haven't you, with people that would like to experience the environment safely beforehand.
Yeah, definitely. I know I'd say that's something that I prefer as well. And going into my flying, I started off with a phobia and decided to overcome that by getting my license. But for me, that process of even getting to that point of taking a first flight was a lot to do with experiencing the sights and sounds and seeing the operation, but also flight simulation, which is something I don't often admit to. But it is a really valuable part of people with, for people with sensory impairment.
Very good. Let's see, our next question comes from Rohan. My doubt is that we should differentiate the seating arrangements between disabled and abled ones. How to accommodate them? Should we have separate arrangements?
Sorry. I think that if you can stick to one arrangement, that would be ideal. But as we said a minute ago, to make it as flexible as possible, say make it easy to take a seat out to make space for a wheelchair, pop it back in if you got all the passengers able to use those chairs. I think to standardise it, but make it as flexible as possible will be successful. Michael, and to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Building in modularity, building in flexibility is absolutely key. And you have to do that because disability varies from person to person. Nobody is the same. So ultimately, you're not going to make it 100% right for everybody. But what we're going to do is try together to make it as usable by as many people as is practical. So, for example, some wheelchair users, some paraplegics can very easily slide off their wheelchair into a conventional seat. Somebody like myself that can't self-transfer will need lifting into that seat, or I will need to stay in my wheelchair. So already there's a conundrum there. That's a big difference. As Bob and Al have said, you know, the weight limitations are immense with this type of flight. So, you know, is there a part of the solution which means working with mobility equipment manufacturers? For example, could a wheelchair be designed that's made from carbon fiber, that's very light, that's already fitted to the individual, which is also a certified aircraft component? So could that chair then be used in your eVTOL design? So you make the wheelchair a certified part of the aircraft, crash tested, the right weight, the known weight, so you know what exactly you're working with. So that's something else to think about.
Yeah, so there is an aspect that if you read the RFP, we're asking for two configurations. You have to have a design that accommodates people with reduced mobility, but you also have to have an aircraft that is going to be used by an operator who is intending to fly passengers for revenue, and he wants to carry 4 people. And you have to have the aircraft be flexible. And I think that's what Harvey was saying. We're looking for flexibility and be able to do both missions. And that's something important to keep in mind. And we're asking you, you know, focus on the design of the aircraft. It's a huge task for students to get through the RFP requirements and really focus on that, what the RFP is asking for.
I wondered if now would be a good time to bring up a bit of a serious point, but one that I believe is really important to the design. And that is not only making sure that people specifically with reduced mobilities can enter and exit an aircraft, but what happens if something goes wrong? Currently, sorry, my headphone again. Currently, if a aircraft needs to be evacuated, people who are immobile are left. And if they survive, that's great. But if not, then that's just life at the moment. And I do believe that this is a big oversight in aviation today. To work into your design a way of people with reduced mobility to exit the aircraft in a hurry if they have to try and improve that for future generations. That would be really valuable.
Okay, our next question comes from Matt again. What are some factors, such as noise, environment, or vibrations, that cause discomfort in flight? Are they more pronounced? Excuse me. Are any more pronounced than others to persons with disabilities?
I don't think so. Since we're talking about persons with reduced mobility, those environmental factors are less of a concern. Harvey, what do you think?
Yeah, I think they're less of a concern. Obviously, for everyone's benefit, you want your craft to be a nice and comfortable place to be. And I think that point is just across the board, not exclusive to your disabled passengers.
I tell you what is important
temperature?
Is the noise environment around loading and disembarking, because you do need to be able to communicate when somebody with reduced mobility might need to say, can you help me, push me here, pull me there, or I'd like to do X, Y, and Z. So actually, you do need a fairly quiet environment for that loading to take place.
Yeah, and Marcus just came up with a really good point, which I should have said because it affects me every day. But from my point of view, temperature is really important. If I'm very cold, I shake more, and when I try to stop shaking, it gets really painful. To have it at a nice temperature and perhaps allow that temperature to be moderated by the user would be really ideal.
That's great insight. That's something I hadn't never thought about. Following up on Matt's last question, what are some of the most common challenges you face with ingress and egress? And I think we started to cover that a little bit.
Yeah, just to jump in real quick, I think one of the biggest challenges is risk to others. And I think disabled people have to accept that they are at increased risk when they do something. So, for example, I know that, for example, when I'm driving along the freeway, the motorway in my vehicle, and that vehicle has a failure, for example, it catches fire, I know that I cannot get out of the vehicle as quickly as an able-bodied person. But as a disabled person, I have the choice. And I decide to make that choice to accept that very minimal but increased risk, that if there's a problem with the vehicle, then I'm at increased risk over an able-bodied person. And I think that's the same for any mode of transport. And I accept that risk, but I do worry that, do I put others at risk, able-bodied people at risk, that might try and assist me if they would like to get me out of that vehicle. So if an aircraft has an accident, is the crew then going to try and get me out the airplane? Because hey, nobody likes to leave anybody behind, do they? So that's really probably my sort of primary consideration is I'm taking the risk, but what about those around me?
Understandable, yes. Once again, Matt's coming through with lots of questions this morning. How do you think FAA or EASA can better support PRMs through regulations and standards?
It's funny, I was at a UAM conference last week here in the UK, and I think one of the biggest points I noted was that of collaboration. Nobody's got all the answers at the moment. So if we take a community approach working together, so the regulator, the manufacturers, and the wider community, people like ourselves, people with disabilities, I think by tackling the problems together, understanding the challenges we all face, we as disabled people understand that these are not easy aircraft to develop. And likewise, I think the manufacturing community and the regulators realise that there's a greater role to be played in supporting wider society to travel in these new forms of flight. So I think if we can keep the dialogue going, conversations like this will be part of solving the problem.
And I think it might be worth keeping in mind from an OEM perspective, our requirement is to meet the federal aviation regulations, which are mostly there based on accidents. And we have to design to achieve a safety level so that accidents don't happen. The part of and that's what the FAA is rightly concerned about. Their mission is safety, and to get the planning into a new system to where from the start we can accommodate persons with reduced mobility is really on the OEM, because they still have to meet all the safety requirements, but they have to come up with a design that also features this new goal of having easy access for persons with reduced mobility. But they are sort of separate items, and you're probably not going to convince the FAA that they have a mandate to do something that's not strictly related to safety or emissions or something like that. That is their primary goal.
But part of this effort, what's important is that to start thinking about what is necessary to support people with disabilities in an aircraft. You can think of your inputs through this project as informative to future regulation, because part of it, you don't want the regulators to come out ahead of the technology, because they'll have a tendency to block it. And so it's about two things. It's about safety and about there's always going to be a trade-off to having access. The most safe aircraft is one that cannot get off the ground.
That's a good point. And the industry, eVTOL, cannot afford to have an accident in its early days. You know, so safety is going to be right up there in terms of the regulatory priority, isn't it? Well, it's the top. It always has been the top, but there'll be an even increased focus because there's a nervousness about, you know, that first accident.
Yeah.
I think this next question we started to address, but I'll ask it anyway. What is the aviation industry doing right now to support Ingress and egress for PRMs, and how can these practices be improved?
I think that varies on a country by country basis, but certainly within Europe, the conventional access to the aircraft is actually regulated by the operator of the airport, would you believe? So it's not the airline, it's actually the operator of the environment that's responsible for getting somebody into their seat on the airplane. Obviously, in an emergency, getting off the airplane quickly, that's, I think, done on a regulated basis, again, by the operator as well, to come up with the rules to get that person off the airplane. But that's why you may have seen, well, you may not know actually, that disabled people with reduced mobility are not allowed to sit in the exit aisle near the emergency exits of a commercial airliner. So those kind of considerations will be required for your designs as well, to not inhibit the exit of the aircraft quickly if required.
And the FAA does have standards for egress that are based on that being able to get out of the aircraft in an emergency, and it's going to extend to things in a helicopter like the windows. The windows are typically, you can open the window that normally wouldn't be openable, but they push out if there's an emergency. And so there are FAA regulations that specify what the size of an egress opening has to be, but even that is probably not factoring in someone who moves with a wheelchair.
It goes back to that personal choice and that risk management, but unfortunately, many disabled travellers are probably not aware of that increased risk in that environment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Our next question comes from Richard. Is there an existing vehicle or environment that you found that has good accessibility? Perhaps something that we can take inspiration from and draw ideas from.
That's a good question. Sometimes, we all dream about our ideal transportation solution. But again, all I can do is talk about my own personal situation. Something that I can stay in the wheelchair but has space. So something with a ramp so I can drive in the back. So, typically a transport airplane that I can drive in the back of and attach the wheelchair to that vehicle with tie down straps, and I can stay in a wheelchair. That would be my dream solution.
Yeah, I think going back to what we use here at Aerobility, we do think every now and then what is the aircraft of choice for disabled people, and it always comes back to the PA-28 Warrior, because you got that big apron door that suit many disabilities, and that can swing open quite far. But the main thing about it is it's a real robust machine. It's got a big section on the spar that you can stand on, and all the switches are quite robust, and inside you've got space. So I think for me it would be just an aircraft that isn't flimsy. It needs to be a good proper aeroplane.
That's a great point, Harvey. Yeah, we disabled people or people with PRN, passengers with reduced mobility, are very tough on airframes. We tend to grab things, we tend to lean on things, we tend to sit on things that were never designed to do that. So if you can build that strength into something you might not need, you think, to build strength into, like a headrest, actually when somebody with a disability pulls on that with 100 kilos of weight, that's got a stress. So again, that's that balance between strength and weight. But yeah, disabled people are tough on the environment around them sometimes.
Indeed, it's difficult. Next question comes from, I guess, Matt again. In addition, we want to thank Marcus Harvey and Mike, for joining us and giving us additional insight on how we can best support persons with disabilities. It's extremely important for us to engage with the relevant stakeholders as we want to provide accessibility in the best way possible. So I guess not so much a question as a thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Our next question comes from Suraj. What problems are faced by individuals who use portable oxygen concentrators on board an aircraft, and how do we accommodate these devices?
To be honest, I have no knowledge of that other than my own situation. So as you may have noticed on the screen, I use a ventilator. So I effectively have muscle weakness, so I don't breathe as deeply as I should. So I have a machine which basically blows high pressure air through a nose or through my mouth, so my lungs fill more deeply and I respire more normally. So that is certified to carry on a commercial airliner. So it has conventional lithium battery and is just like any other electrical device, is certified in that environment. But I would imagine oxygen concentrators may be similar, but I think we'd have to check the legislation. Guys at Bell, do you have any knowledge of that?
I don't. No. Just oxygen.
But if it is, certified equipment, then that you should think about, is there anything that the aircraft needs, a compartment somewhere to store that next to the person using it, and consider that and also the weight. And I don't know if there's the flight that we're talking about that the aircraft is designed around is a fairly short flight. Probably don't need to have recharging equipment on the aircraft, but and I don't know how long can that equipment go without a charge. It probably go quite a while, right?
Yeah, I would talk to guys who have involvement with air ambulances because I know that they have oxygen on board. So tapping into their expertise would be ideal.
The thing to keep in mind for the design is for any type of special accommodation to be, say, available as an accessory to where it does not burden the aircraft weight. And that's going to be the one word that you'll hear from us the most is weight. That is the one term that matters. And so in terms of the aircraft design, this project has really just two phases. And that is to have a properly designed and laid out cabin that can accommodate people with disabilities, also to be able to carry a fairly high density passenger arrangement from which the operator can make money. And then the rest of the solution is to be able to lift it and carry that cabin from point A to point B. And that's going to be the question of weight. That's going to determine the overall size.
And you can see in the RFP that, we did not ask to carry 4 persons with reduced mobility. We reduced that requirement, and the consideration there is weight, because we know that Mike mentioned the weight of the wheelchair, and those are the things that you have to factor for that configuration of the aircraft. So it is 2 passengers in that configuration, and then if you're not doing a mission for persons with reduced mobility, the aircraft can still do it, but you configure it for 4 passengers so that the operator has the maximum opportunity for revenue. And that is a very important consideration for an OEM. You're making a huge investment, billions of dollars of an investment to get an aircraft certified. And you have to be able to come up with a design that I can produce thousands of these. And the only way you can produce thousands of them is to have operators who are willing to buy them because they can make money on them. And they're going to be wanting to move 4 passengers back and forth continuously. However, the aircraft can accommodate persons with reduced mobility, and the RFP is asking you to design one that can carry 2 people in that configuration comfortably, with all the considerations that are being discussed here today.
Something that's just crossed my mind, actually, in that configuration of 2, it can be that a person with reduced mobility needs to travel with a carer. That carer might be the only person to take the second seat.
Well, that might be a situation where the carer is the second passenger.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Also, moving on from those points, you guys are aeronautical engineers. I know you get this, but don't be frightened of setting a limit. As you know, aerial transportation, high energy transportation is not forgiving of blurring the lines. You know, if you have set a weight limit, then you cannot go the other side of that weight limit. Somebody cannot travel if they exceed your design limitations. That's life. That's traveling in the air. So don't be frightened of stating that point. You know, you can't, you know, it'll be all right today or it'll be all right tomorrow. Aviation is very unforgiving of that.
Yeah, and to that point, you know, if the situation is what it is, and you're always going to be up against a weight limit, you might just be. I have a particular passenger with this wheelchair equipment, and then in that case, well, you're going to transport 1 person, and that's okay too. You stay within the limitations, but we're asking for the aircraft to be flexible.
Okay, our next question comes from Yaren. What is your opinion on designing for disabilities with opposing needs?
With opposing what?
Needs, N-E-E-D-S.
Not sure what an opposing need is.
I think Marcus has an opinion on that.
Okay.
I just what an interesting question. I guess is the question getting at one person with a wheelchair and somebody with a visual impairment? How do you accommodate both? And I'd probably hand to Harvey and Mike to answer that.
That goes back to flexibility again, surely.
I think that's what they were getting to, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, we can move on to the next question. This one is from Abhishek. Many regulations mention that we can't take battery-powered wheelchairs aboard an aircraft. Do you think allowing battery-powered wheelchairs can be helpful? Is it possible to dismantle them?
So my wheelchair, I can take on a commercial airliner. So most commercially available electric wheelchairs are now certified to travel in airplanes. And you're absolutely right. That's really about the worry about the battery. All that stored chemical energy is a real risk if it's not certified to travel in that environment. So most sealed lead acid gel batteries, lithium batteries are now safe to travel. So I think it would be okay in this environment and to consider that a given.
All right, good. Next question comes from Carlotta. Some disabilities can get triggered unexpectedly. How does Aerobility deal with these events when they appear during flight?
That's a good question. I think we have some of our current flyers that experience that, where they have good days and bad days. So in one of our aircraft, for example, the Technam aircraft, which is fitted with both conventional controls and a single lever control which can operate the rudder and the throttle together, then they trade in both systems. So on a good day, they can fly with the conventional controls, but if their legs get tired or they have a spasm in their legs, then they can resort to the hand control system. So again, building in that flexibility has been key for individuals that have variable levels of disability.
Very good.
Sorry, I think also prior planning and experience comes into that. So before people come flying with us, they fill in a participant information form which asks medical questions covering the really big topics like does someone suffer with fits or challenging behaviour. So I think if it's possible to get that information beforehand, and then once they're on the craft to have the experience and skills to deal with that should it arrive. And I think on the type of aircraft we're talking about, this experience will come from a carer or friend who is traveling with them.
So maybe one thing to just to add to that, you know, the sort of endless possibilities. And again, you students have to answer the RFP. Use that to your advantage. Stick to the requirements that are in here. We're not asking you to design a certified aircraft. That's our job, and it takes us years to do it. You have a couple of months to do this. Focus on the requirements that we're asking about. And sometimes we say it around here, don't create imaginary requirements. These are all important issues in the real world. And if you want to address that, that's fine, but don't go down paths, because you can go down rabbit holes that will absorb all your time. And we have to do that in the industry as well. We put forward a set of requirements in the RFP, working with Aerobility. And I want to make sure students stay focused. Read the RFP, answer the questions of the RFP, and if you do that, you'll have done a good job for answering both the certification side and the accommodation side.
Right, but you can also, in terms of wanting to address some of these things, address it in a discussion. Talk about what trade-offs that you considered and say, we felt that this was something we could address. This is something that can be or should be thought about in the future. But as Al said, you've got a lot of work to do, and you need to have the discipline to stop at some point and move on.
Great points, yes. Always designed to the requirements. Next question comes from Abhishek again. What are things you find really good and those which need improvement with commercial aircraft and their interactions towards disabled people?
Again, clearly it's a very restrictive environment for some people with reduced mobility. You know, for many people, it's absolutely fine. But one of the biggest challenges, I think, is time available. So we're lucky at Aerobility. We can take the time it takes to get somebody safely into the airplane. But in the commercial environment, clearly there is a huge time pressure to turn that vehicle around, get it back in the air. So I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges is the time available. And that's going to be the same for eVTOL. It's a commercial environment. There'll be lots of cycles in the day. A disability will slow those cycles down unless the environment is meeting these challenges.
Okay, and I believe we have our last question. It's from Rohan. How many passengers, disabled/abled, should we aim for in the air taxi?
It's in section 2.2.11, right?
Yeah, it's stated in the RFP. It's a hard requirement.
What was that section again?
They should read the RFP, but I'll be generous and say it's 2.2.1.1.
Yeah, it's basically asking you to have a pilot, 4 passengers, pilot, and 2 persons with reduced mobility.
If you learn anything today, guys, just read the RFP and then read it again.
Yep, absolutely.
And then weigh it.
Yes.
Nice one, Mark. That was good.
So Rohan just responded to that answer saying it is stated, but it seems ambiguous. So perhaps he should.
There were, I know students had a chance to submit questions to the VFS. I'm not sure that that question was in our list. I don't think it was, but
It was asked ambiguously too.
Well, so I will say, so being the systems engineering representative, here at Bell, there are 2 shall statements in that section. Shall is something that you must do, right? Each one of those. So it shall have 1 pilot and 4 passengers with full mobility, and it shall have a single pilot and no less than 2 passengers with disability. So it's pretty clear to me.
And it's not the same interior layout. It is the same interior volume.
Right.
The creative part of your design is to optimize that volume to where it is as small as possible for weight and drag, but accommodates the 4 passengers for the high density, high revenue mission, but can also accommodate 2 people with disabilities. And as we discussed, if you want to accommodate a person with, let's say, a more extreme disability who requires a caregiver, then allow yourself the freedom to say my second person is the caregiver.
You still meet the requirements that way in the RFP.
Outstanding. That is all the questions that we have submitted at this point.
all right, very good.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Brilliant. Good luck, everyone.
Thank you.
Marcus, Mike, and Harvey, we really appreciate you coming on and providing your insights and perspectives. And I think as the students get further along, if they have further questions, they have your contact information and can reach out to you. And Al and team, we appreciate you guys coming on this morning and providing your insights as well and guiding the students towards getting to the end of this design project. So thank you so much.
Happy to do it. It's an exciting project.
Good luck, everybody.
Cool. Good luck. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good luck.
All right, Julie, is there anything else that you have?
Nope. I will share the presentations with the team captains. I also have Bell has responded to the questions, so I'll push that out by the end of the week, and should be in good shape. And the recording, we will post the recording on the event page. Might need a couple of days to do that, but once that's up, I'll also send a communication to the teams to let them know.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
All right, with that, I will go ahead and end the webinar and look forward to talking to you all again soon. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Right.
All right, ending now.